We need your room, not you," my daughter-in-law said calmly at dinner. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Neutral, almost polite. My son sat beside her, his fork paused in midair. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. I didn't respond either. I set my fork down carefully, right next to the plate I had barely touched. The roast chicken had gone cold. I could tell by the way the skin had lost its shine. No one noticed. I stood up. The chair made a soft sound against the hardwood floor, louder than I expected in the sudden quiet. My daughter-in-law adjusted her napkin. My son cleared his throat. Still, no one spoke. I walked out of the dining room without saying a single word. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story and let me know where you're watching from. It helps me understand how far this moment traveled beyond that table." The house felt different once I was alone in the hallway. The lights were still on, warm and yellow, the way I liked them in the evenings. I had chosen those bulbs years ago because my husband said harsh light made the house feel impatient. He'd been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks since the casseroles stopped arriving. 3 weeks since people stopped asking how I was holding up. And now, apparently, long enough for me to become inconvenient. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch. The cushions still held their shape. I'd always taken care of things, even small ones like fluffing pillows and keeping throw blankets folded just right. Old habits don't disappear just because someone does. From the dining room, I could hear them talking again. Their voices were low, practical. Words like space, plans, and timing drifted down the hall as if they were discussing a renovation, not a person, not me. I looked around the room slowly. The framed photos. My wedding picture, taken 42 years ago, when my hair was dark and my husband's hand rested proudly at the small of my back. The bookshelf we built together one summer, measuring twice before cutting once because he hated wasting wood. The clock on the wall he insisted on winding by hand, even after we could afford a digital one. This was the room where I learned how to live without him. And now, apparently, where I was no longer meant to live at all. I didn't cry. Not then. I had cried enough already, in private, in the quiet hours before dawn when grief feels less embarrassing because no one is watching. What I felt now was something else. Something colder. Heavier. Erasure. I went upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my husband for decades. The bed was neatly made. I had done that morning, smoothing the sheets the way I always did, even though no one but me would see it. His side was untouched, just as I'd left it since the day he didn't come home from the hospital. I opened the closet. My clothes were still there, lined up by color. Dresses I no longer wore. Shoes sensible enough to last. Coats for winters I wasn't sure I'd be spending in this house anymore. Downstairs, I heard laughter. Light. Relieved. They thought the hardest part was over. I closed the closet door gently and sat down on the bed. The house was still mine, at least for the moment. The walls hadn't moved. The keys were still in my purse. The papers were still where they had always been. They needed my room, not me. That was fine. I had learned, after all these years, that people often reveal their plans before they realize you're paying attention. And I was listening now. The house was quiet the next morning. Not the peaceful kind of quiet my husband used to enjoy when he'd sit at the kitchen table with his coffee and read the paper. This was a hollow quiet. The kind that makes ordinary sounds feel intrusive. The refrigerator hum. The clock ticking. My own footsteps moving from room to room. I woke up before sunrise, as I had every day since the funeral. Old habits don't wait for grief to catch up. I made coffee for one, poured it into the mug he liked, then stood there, holding it until it went untouched and cold. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the chair across from me, his chair. The one no one else ever used. It stayed empty now, like a sentence that had been cut off in the middle. After breakfast, I washed the cup, dried it, and put it back exactly where it belonged. Top shelf. Left side. That was how he liked things. Order mattered to him. It still mattered to me. The house had changed since he died, but not in obvious ways. The furniture hadn't moved. The walls hadn't been repainted. What had changed was how people moved through it. My son no longer asked before making decisions. He announced them. Times, appointments, visitors. My daughter-in-law spoke more, smiled more, as if confidence had finally found its place. She walked through rooms like she was measuring them, her eyes stopping briefly on doorways, corners, windows. I noticed these things without commenting. I folded laundry that wasn't mine. I cooked meals I didn't eat. I stayed out of the way. Grief didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves I learned to predict. Late afternoon was the worst. That was when my husband used to come home, set his keys down, and ask what smelled good. Now, that hour came and went without acknowledgement. 3 weeks after the funeral, people assumed I was finished grieving. That was when the questions started. How long do you think you'll want to stay here? Have you thought about something smaller? This house is a lot for one person. They said it gently. Reasonably. As if the problem wasn't me, just the math of square footage and utility bills. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that I had managed this house through illnesses, layoffs, and decades of ordinary life. That I knew which floorboard creaked and which window stuck in winter. That this place had been built by my hands as much as my husband's. I let them talk. One afternoon, I came upstairs to find my closet door open. Not wide. Just enough to notice. A sweater had been moved. Folded differently. Someone else's idea of order. I closed the door and said nothing. Another day. I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone, her voice light, confident. She was talking about timelines. About when things settle. She laughed softly, like the outcome was already decided. I stood in the hallway and listened until the call ended. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting the small cracks near the corner. I had counted them before, during storms, during arguments, during nights when my husband couldn't sleep. They were still there. Proof that not everything disappears at once. The house was still standing. So was I. In the morning, I dressed carefully. Not for anyone else, for myself. I brushed my hair, chose a sweater that still felt like mine, and moved through the house at my usual pace. They thought my silence meant agreement. They mistook grief for confusion. They mistook my age for weakness. I didn't correct them. I had learned something important in those quiet weeks after my husband died. When people believe you are finished, they stop hiding what they plan to do next. And I was still here. Listening. The changes became harder to ignore after that. They were small at first. Practical, even. My daughter-in-law started referring to rooms by function instead of memory. The guest room became the office. The den became extra space. My bedroom was no longer mentioned by name at all. Just the room upstairs. One morning, I came down to find a clipboard on the kitchen counter. Papers neatly stacked, a list written in her handwriting, measurements, notes about storage. I recognized the tape measure beside it. Ours. The one my husband used to keep in the junk drawer. No one had asked me to look at it. No one had asked permission. My son walked in while I was standing there. He glanced at the clipboard, then at me. For a moment, I thought he might say something. He didn't. He reached for his coffee, took a sip, and stared out the window instead. That silence said more than words ever could. Later that afternoon, I overheard them talking in the living room. Not whispering, just assuming I wasn't listening. "We'll need to clear it out soon," she said. "Yeah," my son replied. "Mom has a lot of stuff." Stuff. Decades reduced to a word meant for sorting and disposal. I stayed where I was, my hand resting on the back of a chair. The wood felt smooth under my palm, worn down by years of use. I remembered sanding it myself when we first bought the set. My husband had insisted on doing it together, even though it took longer that way. That evening, I found one of my boxes moved, not opened, just shifted to the side, as if testing how much could be rearranged without me noticing. I recognized the box immediately. It held old letters, cards, things no one else ever cared about. I put it back where it had been. No one commented. The next day, my daughter-in-law asked me, casually, if I preferred mornings or afternoons for appointments. She didn't specify which ones. She didn't need to. The tone made it clear they were already scheduled in her mind. "Either is fine," I said. She smiled, relieved, as if cooperation had been confirmed. I noticed how often she smiled now. My son started avoiding eye contact altogether. He spoke to me when necessary, always polite, always brief, like a man already practicing distance, like someone rehearsing an ending. At night, I lay awake listening to the house, pipes shifting, air moving through vents. sounds I had lived with for years, now reminding me that everything solid can still be temporary. I thought about the first time we moved into this house, how empty it had been then, how full it became. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesdays that mattered only because we were all there. Now I felt like a guest who had stayed too long. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law knocked on my bedroom door. She didn't wait for an answer before opening it. "I was just thinking," she said, glancing around the room. "This space could really open things up." I nodded. She took that as encouragement and stepped farther inside, pointing out corners, imagining changes aloud. I watched her from the edge of the bed, saying nothing, noticing how comfortable she already seemed. When she left, the room felt smaller. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. The woman staring back was older, yes. Tired, certainly, but not confused, not unaware. They believed I was adjusting. They believed I was letting go. What they didn't understand was this. I wasn't being pushed out, I was being studied, and I was learning exactly how they planned to do it. That night, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. The smell rose up immediately, familiar and sharp, the kind that stays with fabric long after years have passed. Inside were things my husband had insisted on keeping himself. Not because they were valuable, but because they mattered to him. Letters, old receipts, a small leather notebook with his handwriting pressed deep into the pages. I sat on the edge of the bed and lifted the notebook carefully as if it might fall apart if I moved too fast. He used to write in it at night after the house went quiet. I never asked what he wrote. He never volunteered. We had learned over time to respect each other's silences. I flipped through the pages slowly. Dates, names, notes about repairs, appointments, conversations I barely remembered. Then farther in, his writing changed, slower, more deliberate. As if he knew time was narrowing and wanted to be precise. "This house stays with her." I read the line twice. Below it, written months later, another note. "No matter what they say." I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover. The room felt still, like it was waiting. My husband had always been careful, not suspicious, just thorough. He believed love didn't excuse preparation. He used to say that kindness should never require blindness. I remembered him standing in this very room, leaning against the dresser, telling me not to worry about the future. Not because nothing could go wrong, but because he had already thought about what might. "You'll be all right," he'd said, "even when I'm not here." At the time, I told him to stop talking like that. Now, I understood why he hadn't. The next morning, I moved through the house with those words still echoing in my head. I noticed things differently. Not emotionally, practically. Which doors locked smoothly. Which drawers stuck, where important papers had always been kept. Nothing had changed. Not yet. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law mentioned a friend who had downsized beautifully. She described it in detail, like a story meant to plant itself quietly. My son nodded along, eyes fixed on his plate. I drank my coffee and listened. Later that day, I walked into the study my husband used as his office. They rarely went in there. It still felt untouched. The desk was neat. Too neat. He had always left one drawer slightly open. I opened it fully. Inside were folders I recognized, legal documents, property records, things my husband handled personally. I hadn't looked at them because grief had made even paper feel heavy. I took one folder out and set it on the desk. Everything was in order. That realization settled something in me. They were moving quickly, but he had moved first. In the afternoon, I stood at the window and watched my daughter-in-law walk around the backyard, phone pressed to her ear. She gestured as she spoke, confident, already arranging a future that didn't include me. She stopped once and looked up at the house, shielding her eyes from the sun. For a moment, our gazes met through the glass. She smiled. I didn't wave. That evening, I returned the notebook to the cedar chest and closed the lid. I didn't lock it. There was no need. Some things are protected simply by being overlooked. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because I had finished remembering. They believed the past belonged to them now. They were wrong. The past had already prepared me for what came next. By the 5th week, my daughter-in-law stopped pretending. She no longer asked questions meant to sound considerate. She made statements instead. About schedules, about plans, about what made sense now. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen with a stack of mail in her hands and said, almost cheerfully, that she'd taken the liberty of sorting it. Bills in one pile, unimportant things in another. She slid the second pile aside without looking at me. I thanked her. She smiled like she'd done me a favor. My son lingered near the doorway, phone in hand, nodding along as if everything she said had already been discussed. I watched him carefully then. The way his shoulders stayed relaxed, the way he didn't glance at me even once. He wasn't confused. He was committed. Later that day, I returned to my bedroom and noticed the nightstand drawer was slightly open. I always kept it. It's kept closed, always. Inside were small things. A pair of earrings. A folded note from my husband. My reading glasses. Nothing was missing. That was the point. They were testing how much could be disturbed without consequence. That evening, my daughter-in-law knocked on my door again. This time, she waited. "I hope you don't mind," she said, stepping in once I nodded. "But I've been thinking about how overwhelming this must all feel for you." Her voice was soft, concerned, practiced. I sat in the chair by the window and listened. She talked about options, about comfort, about how some people her age struggled with big houses and stairs. She said it slowly, gently, like she was explaining something to a child. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she paused, watching my face closely, measuring my reaction. When I didn't give her one, she filled the silence herself. "We just want what's best for everyone," she said. Everyone didn't include me. After she left, I stayed seated for a long time, looking out at the backyard. The grass needed trimming. My husband would have noticed that first. He hated letting things grow uneven. He believed neglect always showed eventually. So did I. The next morning, I found a brochure on the kitchen counter. A glossy one. Smiling faces. Clean hallways. Words like community and peace of mind printed in warm colors. It hadn't been placed there accidentally. I folded it once and slid it into a drawer. At breakfast, my son asked if I'd seen it. I said yes. He nodded, relieved, and returned to his coffee. No follow-up, no questions. They assumed acceptance because I hadn't objected. In the afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. Someone who had known us for years. She asked how I was doing, really doing. I told her I was managing. She looked past me toward the house, then back again. "Change comes fast," she said quietly. I agreed. That night, I went through my things again. Not out of fear, out of clarity. I touched what mattered. I ignored what didn't. I noticed which items had been moved and which hadn't. Patterns always repeat when people think you aren't paying attention. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next day, my daughter-in-law informed me she'd scheduled a meeting. She said it casually, like an afterthought. She didn't say with whom. She didn't need to. The confidence in her voice told me everything. I thanked her again. Her smile widened. She believed I was cooperating. She believed the house was already hers in all the ways that counted. What she didn't realize was that by stepping so confidently into my space, she had stopped watching me altogether. And that was her mistake. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. She told me over breakfast, her voice casual, like she was mentioning a grocery run. My son nodded as if the date had already been agreed upon. Neither of them asked if I would be attending. They assumed I would. I said nothing. That morning, I dressed the way I always had for appointments. Simple, neat. The same navy sweater my husband used to compliment because it made me look steady, he said, like someone who couldn't be rushed. The drive was quiet. My daughter-in-law talked the entire way, filling the car with details I didn't need. Timelines, possibilities, what made sense at our stage. My son kept his eyes on the road, hands tight on the wheel. No one mentioned my name. The office was small and clean. Neutral colors, comfortable chairs placed deliberately close together. A man stood when we entered. He shook my daughter-in-law's hand first, then my son's. When he reached me, he paused for half a second, surprised. "Oh," he said, "you came too." I sat down. They spoke for a long time before anyone addressed me directly. Words moved back and forth across the table like pieces on a board. Plans, options, next steps. My daughter-in-law spoke with confidence. My son added support when needed, nodding at the right moments. I listened. At one point, the man asked a question and looked at me instead of them. A simple one. Ownership-related. Basic. The room shifted. My daughter-in-law answered quickly. Too quickly. Her voice sharpened just slightly. the way it does when certainty hasn't been tested before. The man nodded, but his eyes returned to me. "I'll need confirmation from you," he said calmly. I met his gaze. "Of course," I replied. Nothing more. On the drive home, my daughter-in-law was quieter. She stared out the window, jaw set, fingers tapping lightly against her purse. My son glanced at her once, then back to the road. That afternoon, the house felt different again. Not lighter, more alert, like something had been disturbed. I went into the study and closed the door. For the first time since the funeral, I locked it. The sound was soft but final. Inside, I opened the folder my husband had organized so carefully. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to. I already knew where the important pages were. He had always marked them with a small pencil line in the corner. That evening, my daughter-in-law knocked on the study door. "I just wanted to check on you," she said when I opened it. Her smile returned, practiced but thinner now. "I'm fine," I said. She hesitated, then glanced past me into the room, as if checking whether anything had moved. It hadn't. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Dinner was quiet. My son ate quickly. My daughter-in-law barely touched her plate. She watched me the way someone watches a door they thought was unlocked. Later, as I washed the dishes, she stood beside me and mentioned how stressful decisions could be at my age. She said it gently, kindly, almost kindly enough to believe. I dried my hands and nodded. That night, I slept without waking. The next morning, an envelope appeared on the counter. Plain. Unmarked. She hadn't handed it to me. She'd placed it where I couldn't miss it. I picked it up, turned it over once, then set it down again. She was trying to regain control. She didn't understand yet that control only works when the other person is still asking permission. I wasn't. I had already moved past that part. The envelope stayed on the counter all morning. I didn't open it right away. I made breakfast first. Toast, coffee. The same routine I'd kept for years. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed. From the corner of my eye, I could feel my daughter-in-law watching me, pretending not to. My son had already left for work. He'd said goodbye without meeting my eyes. When the house finally went quiet, I picked up the envelope. Inside were copies. Not originals. Forms. Schedules. A list of appointments typed neatly at the bottom of the page. Someone else's handwriting filled the margins with notes. Suggestions. Timelines. My future, summarized in ink that wasn't mine. I folded the papers once and set them down. I didn't tear them. I didn't react. I carried them upstairs and placed them inside the folder in the study, right where they belonged. Evidence has a way of organizing itself when you stop trying to ignore it. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was someone I hadn't expected. An old acquaintance of my husband's. He didn't come inside at first. He stood on the porch, hat in his hands, eyes unsure. When he spoke, he lowered his voice, as if the house itself might overhear. "I thought you should know," he said. He didn't explain why he felt that way. He didn't need to. He told me what he'd heard, who had been asking questions. When? About what? I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I thanked him and watched him walk back to his car. I didn't wave. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood. I traced the same line my husband used to follow with his finger when he was thinking. Some habits never leave you. It was clear now. They weren't improvising. They were following a plan. A plan they believed was already approved simply because I hadn't objected. They'd mistaken my silence for permission. That evening, my daughter-in-law was unusually pleasant. She offered to make dinner. She asked if I was comfortable. She spoke slowly, carefully, like someone trying to rebuild a bridge without admitting it had cracked. I answered politely. After dinner, she brought up the meeting again. She framed it differently this time. Softer, less certain. She asked if I had questions. "I understand," I said. Her shoulders relaxed. Later, when the house was quiet, I returned to the study and closed the door behind me. I sat at the desk and pulled out the folder my husband had marked so carefully. I didn't rush. I didn't skim. I read only what mattered. Names, dates, signatures. Everything was still intact. The realization settled over me like a weight and a relief at the same time. They could talk. They could schedule. They could assume. But none of it moved without me. Upstairs, I heard footsteps. My daughter-in-law paused outside the study door, just long enough for me to notice. Then she walked away. She knew something had shifted. The next morning, she asked casually if I'd looked over the papers. Her voice was light, but her eyes searched my face. "Yes," I said. "That's good," she replied quickly. "We just want to be prepared." Prepared for what? She didn't say. Neither did I. That night I slept soundly, not because things were resolved, but because they were clear. I no longer wondered what they were trying to do. I knew. And once you know, patience becomes easier. They believed they were guiding me toward an ending. What they didn't see was that I had already found the beginning of something else. The next few days settled into a pattern. I didn't change my routine. I woke early. I made my coffee the same way. I watered the plants near the window, even the one my daughter-in-law said was probably dying anyway. It wasn't. It just needed time. I gave them nothing to react to. That seemed to confuse her more than anger ever could. She began offering help again. Small things. Folding laundry I hadn't asked her to touch. Reminding me of appointments I hadn't forgotten. Each gesture was wrapped in politeness, but there was tension underneath it now, like a wire pulled too tight. My son watched quietly. He asked fewer questions. He stayed out later. When he came home, he went straight to his room or the garage. Distance had become his way of coping. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone. She didn't realize I was in the hallway. "I don't know," she said, lowering her voice. "She's not pushing back, but she's not agreeing either." She paused, listening. "Yes, I'm sure she's sharper than she looks." I stepped away before she finished the call. That night, I organized my papers, not dramatically, not all at once. I took one folder at a time, reviewed what mattered, and returned it to its place. I made a short list on a yellow pad, the same kind my husband used. Just names and reminders, nothing obvious. I kept it folded inside a book on the nightstand. At dinner, my daughter-in-law talked about future renovations again. This time, she framed them as long-term. She mentioned timing. She asked my son if he agreed. He nodded. She glanced at me, waiting. I took a sip of water. "That sounds busy," I said. She smiled, unsure how to take it. Afterward, I washed the dishes alone. She usually hovered now, as if afraid I might disappear if she didn't keep me in sight. I let her stand there. I didn't fill the silence. Silence does most of the work if you let it. Later that evening, I packed a small bag. Not to leave, just enough to be ready. A change of clothes, my medications, a few personal items. I placed it in the closet behind my coats, where it wouldn't be noticed. Preparedness has a quiet confidence to it. The next morning, a locksmith's business card appeared on the counter. I recognized it immediately. The same company we'd used years ago after a storm damaged the back door. I picked it up, turned it over, and placed it back where it had been. My daughter-in-law watched from the doorway, pretending to scroll through her phone. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. That afternoon, I sat in the living room and looked around slowly. The furniture, the light through the curtains, the way the house still held my husband's presence, even now. It didn't feel like something that could be taken by suggestion alone. They were moving faster. I was moving quieter. At dinner, my daughter-in-law finally asked if everything was all right. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were alert. "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine." She nodded but didn't seem convinced. That night I slept lightly but well. I wasn't anxious anymore. I wasn't guessing. I knew exactly what they thought was happening. They believed I was waiting for instructions. They believed time was on their side. They didn't realize I had already stopped reacting and started choosing. And when you reach that point, you don't need to announce it. You just let them keep talking. And keep revealing. The shift happened on a Friday evening. I noticed it as soon as I walked into the house. The air felt different. Not tense, decided. The kind of atmosphere that settles after a choice has already been made. My daughter-in-law was in the living room, phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call quickly when she saw me, smiling as if nothing unusual had just occurred. "We'll have company tomorrow," she said. "Just someone to take a look at a few things." She didn't ask if that was all right. My son sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, already disengaged. He didn't look up when she spoke. He didn't need to. This was already agreed upon. I nodded once and walked past them. The next morning I woke to unfamiliar sounds, voices, shoes on the front steps, the door opening without hesitation. I stayed in my room and listened. 2 men walked through the house, speaking openly. measuring, commenting. Their voices echoed slightly as they moved from room to room, treating the space like a project instead of a home. "This room's got good light," one of them said upstairs. I recognized the voice immediately. My room. I stepped into the hallway just as they reached the top of the stairs. My daughter-in-law followed close behind them, pointing, explaining, smiling. "Oh," she said when she saw me. "We didn't mean to wake you." She said it lightly, apologetic in tone only. One of the men cleared his throat and glanced at her, then at me. "We were told the space would be available soon," he said. "Soon." I looked at my daughter-in-law. She met my eyes for half a second, then looked away. "It's just an estimate," she said quickly. "Nothing final." The men continued down the hall, already done with the conversation. I returned to my room and closed the door. They stayed for nearly an hour. When they left, my daughter-in-law walked them out, thanking them warmly. She stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching their car disappear down the street. When she turned back inside, she seemed surprised to find me waiting in the kitchen. "Oh," she said again, "I thought you were resting." "I heard them," I replied. She hesitated, then smiled. "I didn't think it would upset you." That was the closest she came to admitting anything. Later that afternoon, I noticed the hallway closet door open. Inside, several of my coats had been pushed to one side. Not removed, just shifted. Space was being made. That evening, my son mentioned, casually, that it might be a good idea for me to start packing some personal items. "Just in case," he said. He didn't finish the thought. I set my fork down and folded my napkin. "I'll decide that," I said. He looked relieved that I hadn't raised my voice. After dinner, I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door. I sat on the bed and let the quiet settle around me. They had moved from suggestion to action, from planning to execution. This was the push. That night, I removed the yellow pad from my nightstand and unfolded it. I read the list once more, then added one final line at the bottom. A name. A time. In the morning, my daughter-in-law announced that she'd scheduled another visit. This one, she said, would help move things along. I smiled at her. "That won't be necessary," I said. She froze, just for a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean," I replied calmly, "things are already moving." She watched me carefully, trying to read what I hadn't shown for weeks. For the first time, she didn't look confident. She looked uncertain, and uncertainty, once introduced, has a way of spreading quickly. The meeting happened sooner than they expected. Not because they scheduled it, but because I did. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn anyone. I simply said I had an appointment that afternoon and would be back later. My daughter-in-law paused when I said it, her hand tightening around her coffee mug. "With who?" she asked. "A professional," I replied. That was enough to unsettle her. When I returned, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that waits for news. I set my purse down carefully and walked into the living room. My son was there, so was my daughter-in-law. They were sitting close together, speaking in low voices. They stopped when they saw me. I didn't sit. I placed a thin folder on the coffee table between us. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to be noticed. "What's that?" my son asked. "Information," I said. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, her smile already fading. She opened the folder without asking. Her eyes moved quickly over the pages, then slower. Then she stopped altogether. My son reached for the papers. As he read, his expression changed. Confusion first, then concern, then something closer to realization. "That can't be right," he said. "It is," I replied. The room felt smaller then. He looked at his wife. She avoided his eyes. I spoke calmly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. The documents did that for me. Ownership, authority, timing. Everything they thought was flexible wasn't. "You told me," my son began, turning to her. She cut him off quickly. "I was trying to help," she said. "You know how difficult this is." She reached for his arm. He pulled it away without noticing. I stood there quietly while they spoke around me, about me, but no longer over me. The balance had shifted, and they could feel it. "You invited people into my home," I said evenly. "You discussed plans that weren't yours to make." My daughter-in-law looked up sharply. "We thought." "You assumed," I corrected. Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. My son exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I looked at him then, really looked at him. "You weren't listening," I said. "That was all. I gathered the folder and held it against my chest, not as a shield, as a reminder. I won't be leaving, I continued. Not now. Not like that. My daughter-in-law stood up abruptly. So that's it? She asked. After everything we've done? Yes, I said. It is. She stared at me, searching for something. Anger, hesitation, doubt. She didn't find it. That night, no one mentioned packing. No one mentioned timelines. The house felt still again, but different than before. Not hollow, grounded. Later, I went upstairs and sat on the bed. I opened the cedar chest once more, just to be sure everything was where it belonged. I slept deeply. The next morning, my daughter-in-law didn't speak to me. My son did. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. He poured it carefully, the way his father used to. They had thought control came from planning quietly behind my back. They learned it comes from knowing exactly when to speak and when to stop. The house didn't erupt after that. It didn't need to. The tension settled instead, low and constant, like a hum you can't turn off once you've noticed it. My daughter-in-law moved through the rooms carefully now. Quieter. She avoided direct paths and took longer routes, as if space itself had become uncertain. My son tried to restore normalcy. He asked practical questions. He offered help with small things. He spoke more, filling silence that no longer belonged to him. His voice carried something unfamiliar. Hesitation. At breakfast, he asked if I'd slept well. I said yes. My daughter-in-law kept her eyes on her plate. Later that day, I heard them arguing behind a closed door. Not loudly, not dramatically. Short sentences, controlled voices. The kind of argument that comes from recalculation, not emotion. I told you it was handled, she said. You told me it was settled, he replied. I didn't need to hear the rest. She stopped inviting people over. The calendar on the refrigerator changed. Appointments disappeared. Notes were crossed out, rewritten, then removed altogether. Control was being pulled back. In the afternoon, my son came to the study door and knocked. He waited this time. I didn't know, he said when I opened it. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. The moment wasn't about reassurance. I should have asked, he added. I should have listened. I nodded once. That was enough. He lingered, unsure what to do with himself now that certainty had left him. Then he walked away, slower than before. That evening, my daughter-in-law finally spoke to me directly. I was trying to protect our future, she said. Her tone was firm, but it lacked its old confidence. You were deciding it, I replied. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time, she seemed unsure which version of herself would be received. She didn't try again. The house adjusted around this new reality. Doors closed more often. Conversations shifted rooms when I entered. My presence was no longer invisible, but it was no longer controllable either. One night, I found my son sitting alone in the living room, staring at the dark television screen. He didn't turn when I walked in. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. I sat down across from him. It always goes as far as people let it, I said. He nodded slowly, as if that thought was settling somewhere uncomfortable. Upstairs, my daughter-in-law packed and repacked the same box twice. I heard the tape tear, then tear again. The sound carried through the house, sharp and impatient. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. But she was no longer sure where she stood. The next morning, she avoided the kitchen until I was finished. She passed me in the hallway without speaking, her shoulders tense, her steps measured. That silence was different from mine. Mine was chosen. Hers was defensive. I moved through the day without changing pace. I answered questions when asked. I declined involvement when it wasn't mine to give. I didn't explain. I didn't revisit the past. There was no need. They had seen the edge of what they thought they could manage, and they had stepped back. That night, as I turned off the lights, I paused at the top of the stairs and looked down at the house one more time. The furniture hadn't moved, the walls hadn't changed, but the hierarchy had. They had believed power came from planning quietly and acting quickly. They learned it comes from patience, and from knowing exactly when to stand still. The house found its rhythm again. Not the old one. Not the version that existed when my husband was alive, and everything moved around his steady presence. This was a quieter rhythm, slower, more deliberate, one that left room for breath. In the mornings, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and watched the light move across the floor. I no longer waited for footsteps that wouldn't come. I no longer braced myself for conversations that felt like negotiations. My son began stopping by the table before leaving for work. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he didn't. When he did, his voice was softer, less certain than before. Not weaker. Just more aware. My daughter-in-law kept her distance. She was polite. Careful. The confidence she once carried so easily had been replaced with something tighter, more controlled. She didn't rearrange anything anymore. She didn't suggest improvements. She stayed within the boundaries she'd finally learned were real. No one mentioned my room again. No one mentioned timelines. The house was no longer something to be managed around me. It simply included me. One afternoon, I went into the backyard and sat on the bench my husband had built years ago. The wood had faded, but it was solid. He used to say that was the difference between things made quickly and things made to last. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees. I thought about how close I had come to being moved quietly out of my own life. How easily that might have happened if I had mistaken silence for surrender. But silence, I had learned, can be many things. It can be fear. It can be grief. Or it can be restraint. Mine had been restraint. That evening, my son joined me outside. He didn't speak right away. He sat down and looked at the yard, at the house, at the place he had grown up. "I forgot," he said finally, "how much of this was yours." I didn't respond. He nodded to himself, as if that answer was enough. Inside, my daughter-in-law watched us through the window. She turned away when she noticed me looking back. I didn't follow. Later that night, I went upstairs and stood in my bedroom doorway. The room was unchanged. The dresser where my husband used to leave his watch. The chair where I folded clothes at the end of the day. The bed I had shared with him for decades. It was still mine. I closed the door gently and turned out the light. People think strength announces itself, that it arrives with raised voices and final declarations. I used to think that too. Now I know better. Strength can look like patience, like paying attention, like knowing when to let others reveal exactly who they are. They had needed my room. What they had almost taken was my place. And that was something I would never give away again. The house went quiet as I settled into bed. Not hollow, not tense, whole. And for the first time since my husband died, I slept without feeling like I needed to be ready to leave.